The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of courtroom 302 as Sarah Johnson stood with trembling hands, her dark brown eyes fixed on Judge William Hawthorne. The 65-year-old judge peered down at her from his elevated bench, his steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes making him look more like a statue than a man. Sarah, a 35-year-old single mother of 2 young children, wore the only formal outfit she owned, a navy blue dress she had bought 3 years ago for a job interview. Her court-appointed lawyer, Mark Stevens, stood beside her, his worn briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. The public defender had assured her that first-time, non-violent drug possession cases typically resulted in probation or, at worst, a few months in county jail. The small courtroom was nearly empty that Tuesday morning. Only a handful of people occupied the wooden benches. 2 law students taking notes, a sleepy-looking court reporter, and Mrs. Martinez, Sarah's elderly neighbor who had promised to watch her children during the hearing. In the case of State versus Sarah Johnson, Judge Hawthorne's voice boomed through the quiet courtroom. This court has reviewed the evidence presented. He paused, adjusting his reading glasses while glancing at the papers before him with obvious disdain. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She thought about her children, Marcus, age 8, and Lily, age 6, waiting at home. They had made her promise to come back in time for lunch. She had kissed them goodbye that morning, telling them everything would be okay. The defendant was found in possession of 50 grams of marijuana. Judge Hawthorne continued, his voice growing harder with each word. While the defense has argued for leniency due to the defendant's clean prior record and family circumstances, this court cannot ignore the severity of the crime. Mark Stevens shifted uncomfortably beside Sarah. Something felt wrong. The judge's tone, his rigid posture, the way his lips curled slightly downward when he looked at Sarah, it all seemed personal, somehow. Your Honor, Stevens interrupted, given that this is Ms. Johnson's first offense, and considering her role as a single mother. Silence. Judge Hawthorne's gavel crashed down, making everyone in the courtroom jump. This court will not be interrupted. The time for arguments has passed. Sarah watched as the judge's face reddened slightly. She had heard whispers about Judge Hawthorne before, rumors about his particularly harsh sentences for certain defendants. But surely, she thought, for such a minor offense. Sarah Johnson, the judge's voice cut through her thoughts, you have been found guilty of drug possession with intent to distribute. This court sentences you to life imprisonment. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her legs gave way, and Mark Stevens had to catch her arm to keep her from falling. Mrs. Martinez gasped from her seat, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Your Honor, this is absolutely unprecedented. Stevens protested, his voice rising. The sentencing guidelines for this offense clearly state. The guidelines are just that, guidelines, Judge Hawthorne snapped. This court has the discretion to impose appropriate sentences to deter criminal behavior. The defendant should have thought about her children before engaging in criminal activity. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as 2 court officers approached her. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Through her blur of tears, she could see Judge Hawthorne gathering his papers, apparently already done with her case, ready to move on to the next one as if he hadn't just destroyed a family. I need to see my children, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Please, they're waiting for me. But Judge Hawthorne had already stood up, his black robe swishing as he turned toward his chambers. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the devastation he had just caused. The door to his chambers closed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo Sarah's fate. As the officers led her away, Mark Stevens quickly assured her he would file an appeal immediately. Mrs. Martinez rushed forward, tears in her eyes, promising to take care of Marcus and Lily until something could be done. But Sarah barely heard them. Her mind was stuck on the lunch she had promised to make for her children, the homework she was supposed to help them with, the bedtime stories she was supposed to read. No one in the courtroom that day could have guessed that this excessive sentence would set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of judicial misconduct and personal prejudices. No one knew that somewhere across town, a person who would change everything was about to learn about Sarah Johnson's case. Marcus Chen sat at his cluttered desk in the city newspaper office, staring at his computer screen with intense concentration. Empty coffee cups and scattered papers covered his workspace, evidence of many late nights spent investigating local court cases. As a 32-year-old investigative journalist, he had developed a reputation for uncovering stories that others missed. "Hey, did you hear about the Johnson case?" Lisa, his colleague from the crime beat, called out from her desk. She walked over and placed a manila folder in front of him. "Single mom, first offense, got life in prison for having some weed." Marcus frowned, picking up the folder. "Life imprisonment? That can't be right." He opened the file and began reading Sarah Johnson's case details. His frown deepened with each page he turned. "Judge Hawthorne," he muttered, typing the name into his database. "Why does that name sound so familiar?" For the next few hours, Marcus dove deep into Judge William Hawthorne's history. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he pulled up case after case. A pattern began to emerge on his screen, a disturbing trend that made his journalist instincts tingle. "Lisa," he called out suddenly, causing several heads to turn in the quiet office. "Can you pull all of Hawthorne's sentencing records from the past 5 years? I need to compare something." As the data compiled on his screen, Marcus's suspicions grew stronger. The numbers didn't lie. African American defendants in Hawthorne's courtroom received sentences averaging 15 years longer than white defendants for similar crimes. Hispanic defendants faced similar disparities. "This is no coincidence," Marcus whispered to himself, scribbling notes on his yellow legal pad. He pinned several case summaries to the court board above his desk, connecting them with red string like a detective mapping out a conspiracy. The sun had set outside his office window when his phone buzzed. It was his contact at the courthouse, Tom, a janitor who had worked there for 30 years. "Mr. Chen," Tom's voice was low and cautious. "You asked about Judge Hawthorne? I think there's something you should see." 20 minutes later, Marcus met Tom in the courthouse parking garage. The older man handed him a worn leather notebook. "Found this while cleaning his chambers last year," Tom explained. "Judge forgot it in his desk drawer. It's his personal diary from when he first started on the bench. You didn't get this from me." Back at his office, Marcus carefully read through the diary. His eyes widened at the judge's private thoughts, the casual racism, the deep-seated prejudices that had no place in a court of law. But it wasn't enough. He needed more concrete evidence. At midnight, while most of the city slept, Marcus created a spreadsheet. He input every case, every sentence, every detail he could find about Judge Hawthorne's rulings. The patterns became impossible to ignore. In drug possession cases alone, minorities received sentences 3 times longer than white defendants. His phone rang again. This time it was his editor, Nancy. "Chen, it's late. Tell me you got something good." "Nancy, this is bigger than the Johnson case," Marcus replied, his voice excited despite his exhaustion. "I got 20 years of data showing systematic discrimination from Judge Hawthorne. But here's the real kicker. I just found out his own son is married to a civil rights attorney." There was a pause on the other end. "Michelle Thompson Hawthorne?" Nancy asked. "The one who's been fighting against judicial discrimination?" "Exactly." Marcus smiled, adding another note to his board. "And guess what? She doesn't know about her father-in-law's sentencing record. Not yet, anyway." "Be careful with this, Chen," Nancy warned. "Hawthorne has powerful friends." Marcus looked at Sarah Johnson's photo on his desk, a simple family picture of her helping her children with homework. Next to it, he placed Judge Hawthorne's official courthouse portrait, the judge's stern face a stark contrast to Sarah's warm smile. "Someone has to speak up," Marcus replied, already planning his next steps. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are real people, real families being torn apart." As he hung up the phone, Marcus didn't know that his investigation was about to uncover something even more sinister than prejudiced sentencing. Conspiracy that went far beyond one biased judge in one courtroom. Dr. James Hawthorne parked his silver Mercedes in front of his elegant 2-story home in the city's upscale Garden District. The 38-year-old heart surgeon had just finished a long shift at Memorial Hospital. As he walked up the stone pathway to his front door, he could hear his wife Michelle's voice coming from her home office. Michelle Thompson Hawthorne sat at her desk, surrounded by legal documents and case files. Her natural hair was pulled back neatly, and despite the late hour, she still wore her courtroom suit. She was speaking intensely on the phone while typing on her laptop. "Yes, I understand the risks," she said into her headset. "But we can't let another family be destroyed by biased sentencing." She looked up and smiled as James entered, holding up one finger to signal she'd be done soon. James loosened his tie and sat down in the comfortable leather chair across from her desk. He loved watching his wife work. Her passion for justice had been one of the things that had drawn him to her 5 years ago, even though it had caused a deep rift between him and his father. "All right, send me the files first thing tomorrow," Michelle concluded her call. She took off her headset and sighed. "You wouldn't believe the case I just heard about. A single mother got life in prison for simple drug possession." "Life imprisonment? That seems extreme," James replied, frowning. "Which judge handed down that sentence?" Before Michelle could answer, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. She opened it and found a link to a newspaper article that hadn't been published yet. "It's from someone named Marcus Chen, an investigative journalist," she said, reading the preview. "He wants to meet with me about a pattern of discriminatory sentencing he's uncovered, and..." Her voice trailed off as she continued reading. "What is it?" James asked, noticing how his wife's expression had changed. Michelle looked up at her husband, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "James, the judge who gave that life sentence. It was your father." The room fell silent. James stood up and walked to the window, his hands shaking slightly. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly, but doubt crept into his voice. "The article has all the data," Michelle continued, scrolling through the document. 20 years of sentencing records. The racial disparities are shocking. And that single mother, Sarah Johnson, her sentence was just the latest in a long pattern. James thought back to his childhood, to the subtle comments his father had made over dinner, the ways he had distanced himself when James started dating Michelle, his complete absence from their wedding. He had always made excuses for his father's behavior, tried to see the best in him. "There's more," Michelle said, her voice growing serious. "The journalist found your father's old diary, the things he wrote, James. They're horrifying. And now he has evidence suggesting there might be financial motivations behind these harsh sentences." James sat back down heavily in the chair. "What do you mean, financial motivations?" "The article suggests links to private prison investments," Michelle explained, turning her laptop so James could see the screen. "Your father might be profiting from sending people to prison." Just then, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. It was a message from James's mother. "Your father is coming for dinner tomorrow night. He says he won't take no for an answer." James and Michelle looked at each other. In their 5 years of marriage, Judge Hawthorne had never once visited their home. He had always made excuses, always found reasons to avoid seeing Michelle. "He doesn't know about the investigation," Michelle realized. "He doesn't know I'm about to learn about Sarah Johnson's case. He doesn't know any of this is about to come out." James walked over to his wife and placed his hands on her shoulders. "What are you going to do?" Michelle straightened in her chair, her decision already made. "I'm going to take Sarah Johnson's appeal. Pro bono. And tomorrow at dinner, your father is going to have to face everything he's done." Outside their window, the sun had completely set, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. Somewhere in a prison cell, Sarah Johnson was missing her children's bedtime, while in a mansion across town, Judge Hawthorne prepared for what he thought would be a simple family dinner, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. The dining room in James and Michelle's home was set perfectly for 4 people. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, and the aroma of Michelle's signature rosemary chicken filled the air. James's mother, Eleanor Hawthorne, had arrived early to help set up, her nervous energy evident in the way she kept rearranging the silverware. "William doesn't know Michelle cooked," Eleanor whispered to her son while Michelle was in the kitchen. "Perhaps we shouldn't mention it." Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a napkin for the 10th time. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. James took a deep breath and went to answer it. Judge William Hawthorne stood on the doorstep, wearing an expensive suit and holding a bottle of wine. His face was stern, as if he were about to enter a courtroom rather than his son's home. "Dad," James said stiffly, stepping aside to let him in. The judge entered, his eyes scanning the elegant foyer with a critical gaze. "Nice place," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Smaller than I expected for a surgeon's home." Michelle appeared from the kitchen, wearing a simple but elegant black dress. "Welcome to our home, Judge Hawthorne," she said professionally, as if greeting a colleague in court. The judge barely nodded in her direction. An uncomfortable silence filled the room until Eleanor rushed forward, taking the wine bottle from her husband's hands. "Let's all sit down, shall we? Everything looks lovely." They moved to the dining room, where Michelle had prepared a beautiful meal. The judge sat down, pointedly looking at his plate rather than at his daughter-in-law. "I've been following some interesting cases lately," Michelle said casually, serving the food, "including one about a single mother named Sarah Johnson." The judge's hand paused halfway to his wine glass. "Court matters shouldn't be discussed at family dinners," he said sharply. "Normally, I'd agree," Michelle continued, her voice steady, "but when someone gets life imprisonment for a first-time offense, it raises questions." James watched his father's face redden slightly. Eleanor looked down at her plate, her fork trembling in her hand. "The law is the law," Judge Hawthorne said firmly. "If people don't want harsh sentences, they shouldn't commit crimes. Even when those harsh sentences seem to fall disproportionately on people of color." Michelle asked, meeting his gaze directly. The judge put down his fork with a clang. "I see what this dinner is really about now," he said, his voice cold. "You've been investigating me." "Actually," Michelle replied, "a journalist named Marcus Chen did the investigating. I just received his findings today. 20 years of sentencing data, your personal diary, and evidence of your investments in private prisons." Eleanor gasped. James reached for his wife's hand under the table, squeezing it supportively. "You dare to ambush me in my own son's house." Judge Hawthorne stood up, his face now deep red, with accusations based on some reporters' wild theories. "They're not theories, Dad," James spoke up, his voice firm. "I've seen the evidence. How could you do this? How many families have you destroyed?" The judge turned to his son, his expression a mixture of anger and betrayal. "You're taking her side? Against your own father?" "This isn't about sides," Michelle said calmly. "This is about justice. Sarah Johnson's children are without their mother because of your prejudice." "Prejudice?" The judge spat out the word. "I've served on the bench for decades. Every sentence I've given was deserved." "William," Eleanor's quiet voice cut through the tension. "I've seen how you judge people. I've stayed quiet for too long. What you did to that young mother, it's wrong." The judge stared at his wife in shock. In 40 years of marriage, she had never contradicted him. "I'm taking Sarah Johnson's appeal," Michelle announced. "And when I'm done, we'll review every case where you showed bias. Every single one." Judge Hawthorne grabbed his coat. "This dinner is over," he announced. "James, when you're ready to apologize for this ambush, you know where to find me." But as he reached for the door, Michelle's voice stopped him. "One more thing, Judge. Marcus Chen's article goes live tomorrow morning. Your colleagues on the bench will see it. The Bar Association will see it. Everyone will know." The judge's hand froze on the doorknob. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in his life, William Hawthorne looked afraid. The next morning, Marcus Chen's article exploded across the city like a bombshell. The headline, "Justice for SALE. Judge's racist sentencing linked to private prison profits," appeared on every news website and social media platform. Inside the courthouse, the normally quiet halls buzzed with whispers and shocked conversations. Michelle sat in her office at the Thompson Legal Clinic, her phone ringing nonstop. She had just finished her third TV interview of the morning. On her computer screen, she had Sarah Johnson's complete case file open, along with dozens of similar cases from Judge Hawthorne's court. Ms. Thompson Hawthorne, her assistant Tracy, poked her head in. "Sarah Johnson's children are here with their neighbor, Mrs. Martinez." Michelle looked up to see 8-year-old Marcus and 6-year-old Lily Johnson standing in her doorway, holding hands. Their eyes were wide and hopeful. Mrs. Martinez stood behind them, her hand protectively on Lily's shoulder. "Come in," Michelle said softly, moving from behind her desk to greet them. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" While Tracy went to get the drinks, Michelle sat with the children on her office's comfortable couch. "I'm working very hard to bring your mommy home," she explained gently. "When?" Lily asked, her small voice trembling. "I miss her bedtime stories." Before Michelle could answer, her office door burst open. A team of FBI agents entered, led by Special Agent Diana Rodriguez. "Mrs. Thompson Hawthorne," Agent Rodriguez said, showing her badge. We need to talk about Judge Hawthorne's connection to Private Corrections Corporation of America. Mrs. Martinez quickly took the children to the waiting room while Michelle shared everything she had discovered. Marcus Chen's investigation had only scratched the surface. The FBI had uncovered offshore accounts, secret meetings, and years of kickbacks. Judge Hawthorne received $5,000 for every person he sentenced to their private prisons. Agent Rodriguez explained, spreading documents across Michelle's desk. Sarah Johnson's case was just the one that finally exposed everything. Meanwhile, across town, James Hawthorne was dealing with his own crisis. He stood in the hospital's administrative office, facing the board of directors. His father's scandal had reached even here. Dr. Hawthorne, the chief of surgery, spoke carefully. Some of our patients are requesting different surgeons. They're concerned about your connection to the judge. James straightened his white coat. My father's actions are not mine, he said firmly. But I support my wife completely in exposing the truth and fighting for justice. Back at the courthouse, Judge Hawthorne sat alone in his chambers, watching his world crumble through the news reports on his computer. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters, other judges, angry citizens. Even his country club membership had been suspended. A knock on his door made him look up. It was Eleanor, his wife of 40 years. She entered without waiting for his response. I packed my bags, she said quietly. I'm staying with our daughter Susan until this is over. Eleanor, please, he started, but she held up her hand. All these years, I watched you destroy families like Sarah Johnson's. I kept quiet. Not anymore. She placed her wedding ring on his desk. When you sentenced that young mother to life in prison, you sentenced your own marriage to death too. As Eleanor left, Michelle was making her way to the prison where Sarah Johnson was being held. She carried a thick folder of new evidence and FBI findings. The emergency appeal hearing was scheduled for the next morning. In her car, Michelle's phone rang. It was Marcus Chen. You need to see this, he said urgently. I just received an anonymous email. Judge Hawthorne didn't act alone. There are 4 other judges involved in this private prison scheme. Michelle pulled over to check the files Marcus had sent. Her hands shook as she read the names. All senior judges, all with similar patterns of discriminatory sentencing. This isn't just about Sarah anymore, she realized. This is about changing the entire system. As the sun set over the city, different scenes played out simultaneously. Sarah Johnson reading her children's letters in her prison cell, Judge Hawthorne sitting alone in his empty house, FBI agents gathering evidence from courthouse computers, and Michelle working late into the night, preparing to fight not just for one mother's freedom, but for justice itself. The emergency appeal hearing room was packed with people early the next morning. News cameras lined the hallway outside, and reporters crowded around the entrance. Inside, Michelle stood confidently at the defense table, with Sarah Johnson sitting beside her in an orange prison uniform. 3 senior appeal court judges sat at the elevated bench, their faces serious as they reviewed the mountain of new evidence. Judge Martha Wilson, the lead appeal judge, adjusted her glasses as she read through the FBI reports. The court calls Special Agent Diana Rodriguez, Judge Wilson announced. Agent Rodriguez walked to the witness stand, carrying a thick folder of financial documents. Her testimony was clear and devastating. We have traced over $10 million in payments from Private Corrections Corporation to Judge Hawthorne's offshore accounts, she explained, displaying charts on the courtroom screen. Each payment coincided with harsh sentences given to minority defendants. From his seat in the back of the courtroom, Marcus Chen typed rapidly on his laptop, documenting every word. His original story had now grown into a national scandal. Next to him sat James Hawthorne, who had taken a day off from surgery to support his wife and Sarah. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. Judge William Hawthorne entered, but not in his usual confident manner. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. Dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept. I need to speak, he announced, his voice shaking. I need to confess everything. The room erupted in whispers. Michelle and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. James sat up straighter, watching his father closely. Order in the court, Judge Wilson commanded, banging her gavel. After a moment's discussion with the other appeal judges, she nodded. Very well, Judge Hawthorne. Step forward. William Hawthorne walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. He looked older than his 65 years as he turned to face the crowded room. "For 20 years," he began, his voice barely steady, "I have betrayed my oath as a judge. I accepted money to send people to private prisons. I let my prejudices influence my judgments. I destroyed families." He turned to look directly at Sarah Johnson. "Ms. Johnson, what I did to you was criminal. You didn't deserve a life sentence. No mother deserves to be separated from her children for such a minor offense." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. In the gallery, Mrs. Martinez held Sarah's children close. Little Lily buried her face in the older woman's shoulder, while Marcus watched everything with serious eyes. "There are others involved," Judge Hawthorne continued. "4 other judges, 3 politicians, and 2 prison company executives. I have their names, dates, and payment records." He pulled a USB drive from his pocket. "Everything is here." FBI agents stepped forward to take the drive. Agent Rodriguez quickly plugged it into her laptop, her eyes widening as she reviewed the files. "Your Honor," Michelle stood up, addressing the appeal judges. "In light of this new evidence and Judge Hawthorne's confession, we move for immediate dismissal of all charges against Sarah Johnson and her immediate release." The 3 appeal judges huddled together, speaking in low voices. The courtroom held its breath. After what seemed like hours but was only minutes, Judge Wilson looked up. "In light of the extraordinary circumstances and evidence of judicial misconduct, this court hereby vacates Sarah Johnson's conviction and orders her immediate release." The gavel struck with finality. Sarah burst into tears as her children ran forward to hug her. The courtroom erupted in applause. Photographers' cameras flashed rapidly, capturing the emotional family reunion. But the drama wasn't over. Agent Rodriguez stood up, motioning to her team. "William Hawthorne, you are under arrest for judicial misconduct, accepting bribes, and conspiracy against civil rights." As FBI agents led the former judge away in handcuffs, he paused near his son. "James," he said softly, "I'm sorry. For everything." Then he turned to Michelle. "You're a better lawyer and a better person than I ever was. Take care of my son." Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded Michelle and Sarah, shouting questions, but Michelle raised her hand for silence. "This isn't just about one case or one judge," she announced. "This is about systemic corruption and racism in our justice system. Today marks the beginning of a larger fight. We will review every case Judge Hawthorne ever handled, and then we'll move on to the other corrupt judges. This ends now." As Sarah walked out of the courthouse holding her children's hands, the sun seemed brighter than ever before. But for Michelle and her team, the real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after Judge Hawthorne's confession, the city was still reeling from the aftershocks. The FBI had arrested all 4 corrupt judges named in Hawthorne's files, along with 3 politicians and 2 prison company executives. Every morning brought new headlines about the scandal. In the conference room of Thompson Legal Clinic, Michelle sat surrounded by a team of 20 volunteer lawyers. The walls were covered with photos and case files, hundreds of people wrongly sentenced by the corrupt judges over the years. "We've identified 842 cases that need immediate review," Michelle explained, standing at a whiteboard filled with names and dates. "Each of these people deserves justice." Sarah Johnson, now free and wearing a Thompson Legal Clinic badge, sat among the volunteers. After her release, Michelle had offered her a job as a community liaison, helping other families affected by corrupt sentencing. "I spoke with another family yesterday," Sarah shared with the group. "Their son got 15 years for stealing food from a grocery store. Judge Parker sentenced him, one of the judges in Hawthorne's network." The door opened, and Marcus Chen walked in, carrying his laptop. The dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept much since the story broke. "You all need to see this," he said, connecting his computer to the room's big screen. "I just received leaked security footage from Private Corrections Corporation." The room fell silent as they watched grainy video footage of secret meetings, showing judges accepting envelopes of cash in parking garages and restaurants. Among them was William Hawthorne, looking younger but just as stern, counting money in his chambers. "This goes back 15 years, Marcus explained. They were targeting poor neighborhoods, especially minority communities. The more people they sent to prison, the more money they made." Meanwhile, across town at Memorial Hospital, James Hawthorne was performing heart surgery. His hands remained steady despite everything happening in his personal life. As he finished the successful operation, his team applauded. Their trust in him had returned after he publicly supported the investigation into his father. Later that afternoon, James visited his mother Eleanor at his sister Susan's house. Eleanor was sorting through old family photos, tears in her eyes. "I found this," she said, showing James a picture from his wedding day. In it, William Hawthorne stood apart from the group, refusing to stand near Michelle. "How did I not see it earlier? The signs were always there." "Mom," James sat beside her, "you're doing the right thing now. Your testimony next week will help put away everyone involved in this scheme." Back at the legal clinic, Michelle received an unexpected visitor. It was Judge Martha Wilson from the appeal court, looking troubled. "Mrs. Thompson Hawthorne," she said, closing the office door. "I've been reviewing cases from the past 30 years. This corruption goes deeper than we thought. There are judges in other cities, other states, all connected to private prison companies." Michelle's phone buzzed, a text from Agent Rodriguez. "White House calling. President wants briefing on judicial corruption investigation." Sarah knocked and entered the office, carrying more files. "3 more families came forward this morning," she reported. "And there's a protest forming outside the courthouse. People are demanding all the corrupt judges' cases be reviewed." The city streets were indeed filling with protesters. Thousands of people carried signs reading "Justice for All" and "Free Our Families." News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the growing crowds. In his prison cell, William Hawthorne watched the coverage on a small TV. His expensive suits were replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his powerful position reduced to a 6x8 cell. When a guard brought him dinner, he pushed it away. "Your son's wife?" the guard said. "She's doing good work out there, helping people you hurt." Hawthorne turned to face the wall, but not before the guard saw tears in his eyes. As evening fell, Michelle finally headed home. James was waiting with dinner ready, understanding how hard she had been working. They sat on their patio, discussing the day's events. "The FBI found more offshore accounts today," Michelle said, exhausted but determined. "This could take years to unravel completely." James took her hand. "Then it will take years. But you're changing the system, one case at a time." Inside her office, the photos of wrongly sentenced people stared down from the walls, their stories waiting to be heard, their justice waiting to be won. The real work of fixing a broken system was just beginning. 1 year later, the Thompson Legal Clinic had moved to a larger building downtown. The sign outside now reads Thompson Justice Reform Center, and its offices occupied 3 full floors. On this sunny morning, Michelle stood at a podium in the main conference room, addressing a crowd of reporters and supporters. "Today marks our 1,000th overturned conviction," she announced, her voice strong and proud. 1,000 families reunited, 1,000 lives restored. But our work isn't finished. Sarah Johnson, now the center's director of family support, stood beside Michelle. She wore a professional suit, her confidence showing how far she'd come from that terrible day in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom. Her children, Marcus and Lily, sat in the front row, both wearing Justice for All t-shirts. Because of Michelle's work, Sarah spoke into the microphones. "I'm not just free, I'm helping other families find justice. We've created support groups, job training programs, and counseling services for everyone affected by corrupt sentencing." Marcus Chen, who had won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the judicial corruption scandal, typed away on his laptop in the corner. His investigation had spread to 12 other states, uncovering similar schemes between judges and private prisons. The door opened, and Eleanor Hawthorne entered quietly, taking a seat in the back. Her divorce from William was final, and she now volunteered at the center 3 days a week, helping families navigate the legal system. "The president has signed the Judicial Reform Act," Michelle continued, holding up the morning's newspaper. "Thanks to everyone's hard work, private prisons can no longer make deals with judges. Every sentence will be reviewed by an independent committee." In the state penitentiary, William Hawthorne watched the press conference on the prison TV. He had been sentenced to 20 years for his crimes. His gray hair had turned completely white, and his proud posture was gone. On his desk lay letters from many people he had wrongly sentenced, some angry, some forgiving, all powerful in their truth. Back at the center, James arrived just as the press conference ended. He had just finished performing surgery on a child whose father was one of the wrongly imprisoned people Michelle had helped free. "There's something else we need to announce," Michelle said, taking James's hand. "The center is opening 5 new branches across the country. We're taking this fight nationwide." The room erupted in applause. Agent Rodriguez, who had become a close friend, stepped forward with more news. "The FBI has created a new civil rights division," she announced. "We're dedicated to investigating judicial misconduct, and we want Sarah Johnson to help train our agents about the human impact of corrupt sentencing." Lily Johnson, now 7 years old, ran up to hug her mother. "Does this mean more kids will get their parents back?" she asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah answered, lifting her daughter up. "That's exactly what it means." Marcus Chen closed his laptop and stood up. "I just got word from my sources," he said. 3 more states are launching investigations into their judicial systems. This is becoming a national movement." Michelle looked around the room at all the faces: lawyers, volunteers, free prisoners, family members, and supporters. She remembered that first day when she discovered Judge Hawthorne's prejudiced sentencing of Sarah. What had started as one case had grown into a movement for real change. "We've created a new organization," Michelle announced. "The National Coalition for Judicial Reform. Every state will have advocates, watchdogs, and support systems. No judge will ever again have the power to destroy lives for profit." Eleanor Hawthorne walked to the front of the room. "I'd like to announce something too," she said softly. "I'm donating my entire divorce settlement to the center. It was money that came from corruption. Now it will help fight corruption." As the day ended, Michelle and James walked through the center's halls. The walls were covered with photos, families reunited, lives rebuilt, justice restored. They stopped at a new photo being hung. Sarah Johnson with her children, standing in front of her new house, her legal degree from night school proudly displayed. "You know what my father said during my last visit?" James asked. "He said you did what he should have done all along: protect the law, not abuse it." Michelle squeezed her husband's hand. Outside, the sun was setting on the city, but inside the center, hope was rising. The fight wasn't over, but the scales of justice were finally starting to balance. And somewhere in the city, another family was about to find hope, another wrong was about to be made right, and the long arc of justice was bending toward truth.